Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Katie Evans, Senior Engagement Manager on the Beef and Lamb team, and I'll be your host and facilitator today. We're thrilled to have such a great turnout for what promises to be a really informative and practical session on how herbal Leys and innovative soil treatments can improve soil health and farm productivity. So today we'll be exploring the ongoing AHDB Beef and Lamb Monitor Farm trial at David Cross's farm, Glover's farm, that is, with a special focus on the establishment of herbal Leys and their impact on soil biology, plant development. And to help us through today's webinar, we have a panel of fantastic speakers who will walk us through the trial, share the latest results, and also provide some actionable insights that you can hopefully apply to your own farm at home. So before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes to go through first. I'll just move my slide on. The webinar will continue for the next hour and a half, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end. So please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function at any time. You can see this at the top right-hand corner of your screens, hopefully. If you experience any technical issues, please use the chat function as well, and our team will help and assist you. We'll also be sharing some additional research and resources after this session, so please keep an eye on your inboxes after. So let me introduce some of our speakers for today. We're going to start with Liz Jennifer. Liz is a lot of people will know her already in the industry, is an independent consultant, and she'll be giving an overview of the work being done on our monitor farm and going through some of the objectives of the field trial and why and where the trial is taking place. We're also joined by Frances Dunn, independent grass and soil forage seed specialist. And Frances will be helping us explore and dive deeper into the establishment of herbal Leys and the role of seed inoculation and compost extract in improving soil health. And finally, we have Nick Padwick representing Wild Soils. He will give us an update on the sustainable soil initiatives taking place at Ken Hill and how they connect to the work that's going to be done on Glover's farm going forward. So with that, we're going to make a start. And to begin with, we actually have our monitor farmer, David Cross, with us tonight. So I'm going to ask David to kind of give us an overview of his farming system and put this trial and piece of work into the context of his system and what, I suppose, objectives and goals it's helping him meet. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so most of you probably know us by now because we're 4 years into this the monitor farm process. But yeah, so we're home farm, about 1,000 acres, sandy loam over chalk. We're just in the point of sort of transitioning from arable to predominantly livestock on multi-species Leys. We've had sheep and cat. Well, we've had sheep probably on the multi-species Leys and lucerne Leys for 5 or 6 years within the arable rotation, and at scale we've had cattle for 3 years now. So just quick stock numbers: we've got around 1,000 ewes, of which we're a multiplier breeding rams with sort of New Zealand genetics sheep, and we have just under altogether with our pathways and a few butilars, just under 600 cattle now. Yeah, all on multi-species Leys. We're progressively getting around the farm, getting the alleyways in, so then just investing in infrastructure through countryside stewardship capital work stuff. Big hit this winter, hopefully. Yeah, so the trial specific to this webinar, we're right at the beginning of scaling this up, so we're just sort of looking at what might benefit the process. You know, the goal is to improve our soils as fast as possible, and we hope that the way of doing that is frequent shift, multi-species lays, tall covers. System's not quite right. There's plenty of things that we're getting wrong. So we've identified some problems around soil and organic matter and biology. So it's trying to work out a scalable, financially viable way of improving these things, or whether we just get better at what the systems and what we're doing without applying whatever that might be, compost or out of a bag or a can, or yeah. So that's what we're trying to find out, but on a practical trial scale. Katie, I don't know if you want to
Right, no, that's
expand
okay.
on that. Yeah.
No, that's brilliant, David. And I'm sure as we go through tonight, you're going to be here with us, and there'll be a lot more reference to the work that you're doing on the farm and how this all fits in. What I'll do for the sake of time, I'm going to go over to our next speaker, which is Liz. And Liz has been instrumental in overseeing this trial. And I've had the privilege over the last few months to work with David and Liz. And I suppose getting into this is actually the second phase of a baseline project was the first phase. Now we're into the second phase. So it's been a really exciting to watch it progress. So I'm going to hand over to Liz now. I'm actually steering. So Liz, you'll have to give me the nod when you need me to move on. But I'll try keep up with you.
Thank you, Katie. So yeah, next slide, please. So as Katie mentioned, I've been working with Dave actually for quite a few years. We started doing some work on some just lucerne grazing, so grazing sheep just on lucerne, and then we sort of transitioned into this sort of project. So last year, as part of the Create project, which was an integrity soils course, I worked with AHDB to help with Dave to baseline his farm. So some of the results we're going to talk about tonight are coming from that project. And through that project, we really had to drill down to understand why Dave was interested in soil in particular. As he mentioned, this isn't, obviously we all wish to save the world as well, but a lot of this is about driving performance on his farm. We've heard that a lot of farms are transitioning out of arable, and they've had relatively hard rotation, so a lot of sugar beet grown, for example. So we've got some tired arable soils moving into herbal lays. And we've also got the power of quite a lot of animals in terms of putting some grazing pressure on those lays. But stock performance, margin per hectare is key. I mean, it's a tenant farm. That financial message is important. We're also trying to drive pasture yield. So again, Dave mentioned high number of animals every year, or every time I speak to him, there's an extra few hundred coming on board. So we're trying to drive pasture yield, and that's trying to reduce, and with zero fertilizer, so nitrogen fertilizer. So we're in this interesting low input, high output system. So that's why we need these soils to be really functioning, and we need to understand why they aren't necessarily doing that all of the time. There's some interest, and this is slightly wider than what we'll talk about this evening, is there is some interest in getting some native bred suckler cows into the system to try and to do a bit more slightly different disruption, and also to help us deal with some pasture quality challenges. And then what's always interesting with Dave is this idea that he's collaborating. So he mentioned his multiplier, his ram multiplier side of the business. He's also working with local landowners for grazing and accessing different land, all sorts of things. So this idea of wanting to work with a range of people as well, and this gives opportunity for his own farm to be rested for quite a significant period over the winter, which also helps achieve some of those objectives in terms of stocking rate around lambing time. So and all of us have, if we scratch the surface, there is depth to just, we want to improve soil health. So, but a lot of this is about financial resilience to the business, as well as making those soils more functional. Next slide, please, Katie. So apologise for the amount of text on this, but so last year's baselining, it involved using Soil Mentor, which is an app, but also a protocol that was established by Integrity Soils. It involved quite a lot of detail baselining, which involved soil test, so both for carbon and also biology and minerals. It also involved doing some transects across those fields to look at what actual crops were in those fields, what amount of grass, legumes, litter, all of that was on the surface. We also dug some holes and looked at rhizosheaths, which is where we've got soil covering root systems, which is a really good indicator that the soil biology is happy, for want of a better phrase. We looked at clover nodulation, which is where obviously digging up clover plants, and we're looking to find these juicy nodules sitting on the roots and pink in colour, so it shows they're fixing nitrogen. So we've got a real interest in legumes just because of the drought tolerance potential of them. They also provide the nitrogen source, so as we're pulling down nitrogen fertilizer, that use of legumes is going to be important. We looked at rooting depth, and this is where within Soil Mentor, it's where 80% of those roots sit, and that's just important, particularly for these soils. We mentioned they're very free draining soils, so we need that rooting structure to be able to harvest moisture from at depth. We also actually with Nick, we did an understanding of the soil food web, so that was looking at the fungi level and bacteria, protozoa, nematodes within that soil, so I'll talk about that briefly. We looked at the tissue balance within the grassland and various herbs. We did some organic matter measurements, so carbon stock measurements, and we also evaluated animal performance. So from that slide, you can see some of this, the field that we're interested in, or the trial that's happening that we'll talk about in a second is on. There were some challenges. So we had low levels. We didn't really have any plants at the time in that field to understand whether we had nodules or rhizosheaths, but in other fields we looked at, we saw this sort of indication that the soil wasn't really functioning as well as we would like. So low levels of rhizosheath, low levels of nodulation. So this dream of getting this high level of stocking rate with continuing with no fertilizer is just something we need to explore, really. But fundamentally in all of this, and this is the point at the bottom of the slide, is that when we looked at mineral levels, and certainly within the soil mineral levels, there were some elements that were challenged. When asked the question in terms of animal performance was always good. So in terms of lamb growth rates, fertility rates, calf growth rates, everything was as you would expect. So we're not seeing major mineral impacts heading into those animals or major energy balances. Some of the challenges is around when we have dry times and the amount of dry matter intake, but we weren't seeing major mineral issues in those animals, and it's important to have this range of views rather than just hyper focus on what one test is telling us. Next slide, please. So as indicated, these soils are formed on top of chalk, so we have high calcium soil, so we're talking pHs certainly over 7s, if heading towards 8s. So that in itself is a challenge. It's incredibly difficult to try and adjust those calcium levels just because we're sitting on a massive lump of it. And that can reduce the availability of phosphate, boron, magnesium, manganese and zinc within those plants, just in terms of that interaction that's happening with those minerals within the soil. So that's something we're aware of. We certainly saw it within some of the soil mineral analysis, but we didn't see it in the plant tissue analysis, and we're not seeing it in animal performance. But the premise in all of this is that actually what we need is fungi to help us within these soils, to particularly the availability of phosphate and other minerals. Also has an important role in terms of water management. So you've got a lot of water being stored in these structures, and it's also moving water around the soil profile. So where we've got these dry sites, that becomes an important part of what we're interested in. Because of that high calcium levels, and we might see, more people might be familiar with the reverse of where you have high mag soils, you have this really tight structure that can cause compaction and can lead to other problems. With high calcium soils, you actually struggle to get a structure. So that those again, as we build the fungi levels within it, that hopefully that will also improve the structure of the soil. Next slide, please. So, Jean, in terms of, and this is partly, Nick will talk about this more later, and I'm sort of amateur enthusiast in terms of soil biology. So we're getting this greater understanding of this relationship between the amount of bacteria and fungi within soils. So if we think about it from a succession perspective, woods are very high, soils in woods are very high in terms of fungi. Soils that have just either been exposed or bare rock tend to be quite high in bacteria. And where our optimum sits is somewhere in the middle. So we would like a 1-to-1 ratio. And again, we'll talk about this more later on. So what we've got at the moment, and it's not surprisingly, because a lot of those soils have only just started to emerge out of an arable, relatively high cultivated system and moved into grassland. So they're yet to sort of start the successional approach back to this sort of more this middle point you'll see here, which is the perennial grasses. What you sometimes see if you've got fields that are chucking out a lot of blackthorns, they're almost moving they're moving past that point and into more fungal dominated. When you've got a lot of annual weeds or brassicas, and that tends to be more bacteria dominated. So we can use things to indicate where we might be on this structure. But again, or we can send a sample to Nick and he'll tell us. So that this is the sort of sitting at the background of all of this is what we're trying to create is this balance between fungal and bacterial levels. And again, this is where this trial started to come in. Next slide, please. So this chalk pit was one of the fields that we used last year for baselining. At that point, it was after potatoes, and this year was after a cereal. So this was part of Dave's plan in terms of getting an SFI option on this for diverse lay. And again, Francis will talk about this in a second in terms of the mixture that went on it. So decent sized field, 17 hectares, and it was basically split into 4. So on one of those quarters, we didn't do anything. So that's the control. On one top quarter, we put granules, which are, if you just move on, the animation should come in. So which is the smart rotational R2 granules, which Francis has used previously. So they are mixed in with the seed and put in the ground as the seeds are being drilled. So that was done on half the field. So you can see the top quarter had granules only. The sort of left bottom had granules plus an application of compost. And that compost was what Dave had been making for sort of the last year or so. And with Nick's recommendations, there were some additional products applied to try and boost the fungi levels. So this was some fish hydrolysate and also some humic acid. And the plan is that then some compost extract will go on after establishment. And again, Nick will talk about talk more about that in a second. Next slide, please. So why, again, this is not wishing to steal Nick's thunder, but again, what we're interested in is how we have this balance between various things. And what we're starting to understand is that the relationship that plant forms with soil biology starts as it germinates. So there's been quite a lot of interest in terms of applying things to crops that are established or a couple of years in. But there's this growing interest in actually applying things. So as that seed germinates and those roots start to really emerge and explore the soil around them, we've got the right mix of soil biology around those rooting structures. So and that's what we're also trying to investigate with this trial. So in the more established fields, we've looked at other things implying different nutrients, but this was an opportunity to actually get right at the beginning in terms of germination, and can we influence how that plant is responding because we've changed the soil biology in the soil that it's been drilled into. That's the theory, and Nick, I'm sure we'll have a debate later on. Next slide, please. So this is Dave's compost. So again, this is for information. So again, Nick will go through this in more detail, but this is a standard format that you get from out of a soil food web analysis. And so it does a count in terms of fungi levels. The first column first couple of columns are the recommended ranges, and then you get the sample results in that third column. The standard deviation just gives an indication of the amount of variation that's happening within that sample. So within the compost, this is the one that Dave made, and we'll bring at the before the Q&As. We'll just talk to Dave about his compost. He did love it by the end. So we looked at fungi, we looked at bacteria within these tests. We looked at this ratio. So we said the optimum was 1 to 1. So again, the recommended range on here was between 0.9 and 2. And this compost was sitting at 0.06. So it wasn't quite achieving what we need to do in terms of boosting this fungi level. So again, that's the next recommendation in trying of adding in products that do enhance or supercharge the whatever fungi is present. It's sort of up scales it. There's also protozoa, which is really important from a nutrient cycling perspective. So they eat bacteria and basically explode that bacteria up and start to release those nutrients back into the soil. So it's an important part of the cycling. So it's like a predator type relationship. Next slide, please. We've also got nematodes, good guys and bad guys. So again, bacteria feeding ones are part of this sort of nutrient recycling approach. Fungal feeding, again, partly nutrient cycling, but in this situation, we haven't got that much fungi, so we don't want something to predate it. And these are more predatory ones, which are the ones that are causing some of the diseases that we're more familiar with. And that right at the bottom is a root feeding one as well. So we certainly found last year where we had issues with short roots, we may have had high root feeding nematodes present. So that's why that root depth was being slightly limited. So that sort of gives us a background to where the sort of premise of where we were. So we had a point where, and this is just quite detailed in terms of the 4 fields we looked at, in terms of what areas were high and low. So just for reference, but gave us background, which is we knew the soils were low, particularly in fungi. We think we need fungi in this system to try and help from a water balance perspective and moving those minerals around. So this trial was 2 different approaches to see how we could boost that fungi level. One, using granules, and Dave mentioned in his introduction, it's about scalable. So he loves his compost, but if he had to produce enough compost alongside running his sheep and cattle, it would be quite a challenge. So actually, can we buy in a solution? Is there something in a bucket that we can use and does the job? But it was important to test the compost. It was also important to test the idea that you can apply the microbe, in this regard fungal levels, but without a feedstock, it will only be there for a short amount of time. So we know from, again, some of the tests that we did the previous year that organic matter levels are low, so the feedstock for these microbes is low. So that's why it was important to put the compost in as well. And that granule plus compost was just interesting to look at that interaction between it. But at that point, I will hand you over to Francis.
Good evening. So my brief was to look at the principles of selection that we used to put together the mixture in this particular situation, but just sort of and then look at what we included then in the Glover's Farm mixture that's in that trial, and I will go through a few pointers on establishment. But I just want to start off that clearly a lot of the interest behind what's going on in this trial being generated in the farming community is from the SFI and stewardship options of what they call herbal Leys. I'd rather discuss them as multi-species pastures, which I think is the expression that David uses as well, because herbs are part of it, but not necessarily the driving part of it in the long term. But building soil fertility, building soil organic matter, creating biodiversity above the ground and below. And now I realise it's not from following on from Liz's session there. we're not just feeding the sheep and the cattle, but that amazing array of bugs and beasts below the ground. So it's I don't think we'll ever understand the whole thing, but clearly understanding the need to create that living soil is very important. So I look upon these type of pastures, and as they're being introduced into arable farms, as a legume fallow option. Really, there is a legume fallow option for 2 years and now 1 year as well, to build fertility and help control some weed problems. But why not produce food as well? So what David's doing of legume fallow with food production is much to my approval. So as far as mixtures and species, the priority has to really relate to the farm and what the farm objectives are. So I would look at a list of things starting with duration. Therefore, the key species have to be performed for the duration of that farmer requires the pasture. There are productivity targets and input strategies. So in David's situation, we've had that described, but quite a lot of these type of things are put in without necessarily having the ambitious livestock performance targets that are associated. But I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be producing 10 plus tons of dry matter per hectare and having very high utilization of it. So some people are using these pastures for mowing, mostly for grazing, some for both. And the more you know about that before you start that selection process, the better. Grazing system is important. You really can't do without a rotational grazing system, as David has. Soil type is a big influence. Certain species perform well on certain soil types, and weather patterns. So here we're in northwest Norfolk, and a very low rainfall area. We're on light land. That defines some of the species we're using. Next, and fairly low down the list, is the stewardship or SFI specification, because almost instantly these are easily fitting into those specifications, and they have become simpler over time. So that allows us to do what we really want to do, and know that we will fit into the specification of the system. Any other objectives? It's important to talk to your seed suppliers about what it is you're trying to achieve, and make sure that they're going to supply that to you. But it must be relevant to the core business. And if you're looking at long-term pasture, then long-term species must dominate within those pastures. The challenge is establishment, weed control, management of quality and utilization. Something that David alluded to and Liz alluded to is we need to have the animal performance, and that is defined by how we manage the quality and how we utilize that pasture with grazing systems. So it comes to adjusting the frequency of cutting or grazing to manage key species for stock performance. Next slide, please. And yeah, that one, that's good. So what I want to just give you an example here of a case study. Go back one if you can. A farm in Dorset that was in, and forward one. A farm in Dorset where they have two farms. The picture there is on a spring calving dairy grazing block. It's a GS4 mixture. And then exactly the same mixture was put into a field, next slide please, which is an autumn calving unit in their silage and support block. Now they were sown in the same year, the same month, and just managed in a completely different way. And what it's really highlights is the fact that there are certain species that will respond to certain sorts of management, and the result of that is you redesign or you design mixtures really according to the use that is required. Next slide, please. Right, this is a picture I took at David's farm in June 23 at the end of a fairly dry period, and some of his pastures were looking quite thin. But one of the great advantages of David having been looking at this sort of farming for a number of years is he had examples of diverse pastures on his farm. And with the seed company Germinal, he did a strip trial of a number of different mixtures, which has allowed him to identify what's working best in his situation, amplified by some of the dry seasons we've had before. I have to say, I'm at the moment surrounded by water and possibility of being flooded by morning, but so it's interesting talking about this topic in this situation. But what was quite clear was the high legume swards were performing by far the best. They were the driving part of the mixture, and the swards were also quite open. And looking at what species thrived sort of drove us towards the mixture we've done this time. Also, in those recent years, he's changed from when he sowed the original mixtures to being all sheep to now being cattle as well. And the cattle grazing, particularly under certain situations, probably demands a slightly tighter, denser sort of sward. So that has defined things. Next slide, please. Back one, please. Yeah, so what we were working with and they had to be 3 years plus in duration. The productivity target was clearly maximum stock performance. The input strategy is low input because now under SFI we can obviously feed these pastures to a certain amount with more artificial fertilizer than in the previous regime. They're for sheep and cattle grazing. The grazing system is rotational but flexible. I think Dave is trying slightly different things. It's light land, low rainfall. This field is in a SAM 3 scheme, and there are clearly other objectives over soil improvement which have to be considered. So next slide, please. So one of the things that Liz and David worked with over recent years has been lucerne. And lucerne wasn't a significant part of the early mixtures, but his performance with lucerne in that dry area has been really very impressive. And it's been driven by work done in New Zealand, where grazing lucerne has become a much more widespread thing in dry country. But one of the things they've learned there really is that early season, your growth is driven by root reserves. And in the first part of the season, you can actually be quite short on your rotations and get good performance. But you have to extend those rotations later in the season to allow building up root reserves for the following year. So it's sort of managing roots and shoots. But it absolutely ties in with quite a lot of the species we're using in the rest of the mixture. So the mixtures we're using have a significant content of lucerne, but it's also considering that these aspects of how you graze it for best effect is included. So next slide, please. And so the mixture we used in this field, and there's some of the farm where David doesn't have chicory this year. It has been quite challenging to manage, but if he knows it's there, he knows how to manage it. So it has more perennial ryegrass, a bit more perennial ryegrass than where we're using in the past, but it's very dense varieties of perennial ryegrass. Timothy and late-heading modern cocksfoots have always done well in his situation. The lucerne in this case is a grazing variety called Luzelle, which is much more adapted to this type of management. In this situation, it was actually packed separately so we could inoculate it fresh for the trial and include it in the drilling. Then red clover, white clover, bird's foot trefoil, late flowering plantains, and grazing chicory. So cost about £130 per half hectare pack. That's just over £100 per acre equivalent. So people may have questions as to what we put in there and why we put it in. We'll maybe come back to that later. Next slide, please. So on to establishment. One of a number of challenges here, but we're sowing a wide range of species, and one needs to accommodate all of them so that you have a long-term balance. So this is a picture of a diverse pasture being established in Suffolk last year, and it's about this time of year. And you can see the sort of diversity within it. Next slide, please. One of the biggest issues we find is, especially with the amount of grass that's going into these various schemes at the moment, is the quality of reseeding techniques. We're using, it's small seeds, they need a fine seed bed, and the seed needs to be put in at the right depth. This is just an example of someone power harrowed, then a wire tine rake with a seed box on it, and buried most of the seed out of sight before rolling it. So attention to detail here is critical. Next slide, please. Weed control. There's a number of perennial weeds which could be a problem. So the sort of management I suggested that lucerne needed actually suits docks very well. And it's important to deal with perennial weed problems prior to seeding diverse pastures, because we do not have any herbicide options other than occasional spot treatments, and the sort of scale you're working on is that's not going to work. In this situation, we're going from arable to grassland, less likely to have these problems, but that's a significant issue, so they need to be dealt with beforehand. Next slide, please. And this is more likely to happen on an arable farm. This is a picture I took last year. Winter barley, reseed after winter barley, minimum tilled. You have to deal with cereal volunteers before you sow a diverse pasture. So it's all about creating time, making time to do a good job. This was rescued by grazing that started the day after I took that picture, but it nearly ruined the whole thing. So cereal volunteers, particularly winter barley, bad news. I may be teaching my grandmother to suck eggs here, but we see this sort of thing every year. Next slide, please. Ground cover. A lot of arable areas now, contractors and farmers have quite wide row spacing drills. This is actually a picture from the same field that I took the initial establishment photograph on, but it just shows some cross drilling and the massively improved ground cover from better ground cover. So narrow row drills or cross drilling, ideally at just 5 degrees to the first, is going to cover the ground with the drill you've got. So you don't necessarily have to go out and buy a fresh drill. Next slide, please. Undersowing is an option, and this is some diverse pasture under some spring barley this year, and that crop was taken off as whole crop. Key thing there is not to sow the barley too thickly, allow it to become a real green, grassy sort of clover-rich whole crop silage. So it's a definite option. Because one of the key issues with a number of the species that we're talking about is that they have a fairly narrow window of sowing and they involve reasonably high soil temperatures. So next slide, please. And again. Yeah, so planning time for successful establishment. Most legumes need to be established before the end of August. Middle of September is sometimes okay, but things like lucerne need about 10 degrees of soil temperature to establish. So, and so that planning for establishment management is important. Next slide, please. There endeth the lesson.
Thanks, Francis. Next slide. So yeah, just a reminder of the trial. So we talked about it before, those 4 areas. So what I did last week was I went out and just move on one. Basically did a germination count on each of those quarters. So that, yes, is not an official quadrant. It is a piece of, I think it came out of a drainage pipe. But anyway, it's the principle of, it's a known area, and I did 20 sites in each of those 4 areas. What that should say is some of the young seedlings were difficult to allocate, so there were still some that were starting to come through. So the challenge with this did go in before we had the rain in mid-September, but because there's now been moisture in the last couple of weeks, it's still germinating, and some of those young seedlings were just really difficult to know what they may become. I'm more of a sheep specialist than necessarily a grass or a seedling specialist, so for that I do apologise. But anyway, the next few slides I'll quickly just run through. So next slide, please. And these are just examples of what I was looking at. So you can see quite clearly where those drill rows are, but you can still see quite a bit of soil. What was evident, you'll see in a second, is there was a bit more weed coming in certain patches. Next slide, please. But they were relatively easy to count. It wasn't like it was wall-to-wall grass, or so yeah, they were relatively easy to do a germination count on them. Next slide, please. So I basically did a count of grasses that came through clovers, and again, I couldn't necessarily differentiate between white or red clover. It was anything with basically 3 leaves. Plantain, chicory is quite obvious at that stage, and then also looked at weeds. So unofficially at the moment is the control has a greater proportion of grass than anything else. I haven't done any stats on this, so this is just descriptive, but it looks like the weeds are slightly higher in the area that got granules. What you might not be able to see from that picture of the field is the quarter that actually has the control in is on a slight hill, and it sort of is north facing and slightly probably got more of a slope on it than anywhere else. So it could be a factor of where we've just put the control site, but it was noticeable there was a lot more weed across other bits of the field. But again, this is stage 1 really. Next slide, please. When I then obviously had a known area and I had a known number of times I did it, I then multiplied that up in terms of getting plants per metre squared. So the target is, in terms of a well-established grass layer, is anywhere between 300 and 400 plants per square metre. And so the control was at that zone already, and the others were heading that way. But as I said, there were some seedlings that I didn't allocate to those each of those categories. Next slide, please. The plan, we talked about rhizosheath and this importance of this, the theory that we want more root development and we want more interaction of root development with the microorganisms that we've put on. So the challenge is there was actually hardly any difference in terms of rooting depth at this stage, but those measurements will be taken up. So this is just a couple of examples. So there was really appearing to be really nicely establishing roots happening in these areas. Next slide, please. I am also an amateur, very amateur microscopy person. So the question was, can we find fungal hyphae or not? And so I did a soil sample from right in the middle of each of those quarters, and then that was just taken for a really simple scan in terms of could I find any hyphae in those soils. There was one probably sacrificic, I can't say it, sacrificate, no, still can't say it, hyphae in the compost treatment, and so that wasn't, we're obsessed with mycorrhizae, but that isn't the same one. But this is probably releasing nutrients from those compost, and that's the only one I saw in the samples. But again, still early days. Next slide, please. Saprophytic. And again, this is when we're starting to do comparisons between this year and last year's work. So on the left-hand side is last year's infiltration rate. That's how quickly 1 inch of water, when applied into an infiltration ring, disappeared, followed by a 2nd inch of water, which so chalk pit is the field we're interested in. That's where the trial is. This time last year, infiltration was 15 minutes, so that equates to 4 inches per hour in terms of how much that soil can take on. This year it was 20 inches per hour it could take on, so the infiltration had dropped quite a lot. There had been some changes in infiltration rate across the other fields, but we'll talk about that on a different evening. So that was interesting, but we obviously can't attribute that to herbal lays. We contribute it to how it's been cultivated to get those herbal lays in, but it was just quite interesting to see that how quickly it can shift and whether it will maintain. Next slide, please. That's the kit I used. In the top corner was the picture, sorry, I forgot to say. So that was the infiltration ring, which is actually the diameter of a flue pipe, and mallet, although I did end up have to use a slightly bigger one, and a piece of wood just to use across the ring. Thank you. Next slide. This is just for the field of interest, so this is chalk pit. Last year, the vast majority of it was soil, and then this year we can start to see there's a bit more coming in. So there's soil, forbs, grass, some litter. Sorry, on the left hand side, that lighter blue color is actually litter. So it's the wrong, I'm not doing very well, but it's the wrong label at the bottom, but it's the right label if you look on the right hand side. Made sense. So you can start to see there's more diversity in terms of when we do that transect across the field. We're starting to see a bit more than last year. It was basically soil and litter, but remembering it came out of potatoes. This year we're seeing less soil being picked up and more diversity. So again, this will build every year. Next slide, please. So that's just an example of it was just a tape measure that was basically put across the field in nearly the same place that last year happened as well. Next slide. So again, there's more opportunity for questions, but the next step is then compost extract, which Nick will talk about in a second in terms of the benefits and how we apply that. So we could be applying it across a band in the middle. So we actually we do the bottom half of granules and control plot, and we do the top half of granules and compost. So we actually create another lot of treatments. And then spring 2027, we'll do some more assessments of rooting depths and rhizosheaths, and we'll do a full soil food web analysis. We've got the baseline from last year, and then that gives us an opportunity to see how it has shifted. And then what we're still exploring is whether we need to do anything with these trace elements, with these high calcium soils. But at that point, I'll hand over to Nick.
Thank you, Liz. So next slide, please. A little bit about me, for those of you who don't know. So I'm a farmer, been farming all my life, and now currently at Wild Ken Hill. I started with the Soil Food Web back in 2021, and I've worked my way through Elaine Ingham's program, and now I'm the Soil Food Web mentor, training in the CLPT and the CTP. I've also, with Liz, spent a bit of time with Nicole Masters doing her Create course, which was great fun. Next slide, please. So this is the journey we find ourselves at Ken Hill, which actually neighbours David's farm, and we use quite a lot of his mouths from his sheep to graze some of our cover crops. But when I took over, we were a very conventional Norfolk farm, lots of roots in the rotation, sugar beet mainly. There had been potatoes and carrots grown without irrigation, which is quite dangerous. And we've moved away from that system to look at principles and practices of regenerative farming, whatever that may be. And within that, I was doing the Soil Food Web stuff, and now we are finding ourselves in a position where we are understanding quite a lot about how we can move the dial quite quickly and move our very damaged and broken soils, certainly in what I've seen in Norfolk. Next slide, please. So we started very slowly making small batches of compost. You can see from the rings below either side of that slide. This was a really great way of learning how, what works and what doesn't work and what recipes work. And before we got very brave and worked out that we could actually make some, really big windrows of compost. And then once matured and gone through the maturation process, we can then start applying that compost either as a solid compost or as a liquid extract. We go through the thermo process. You can see where the thermometer is. That's cow muck. We made some compost from cow muck. We don't use cow muck anymore. But to be able to kill all the pathogens, parasites that we might have within that material that we gather up, we need to go through that heat process. Okay, next slide. And we've got there's 3 rings which we made, and those rings were full when we started. So it just goes to show you how much by composting it reduces the size of your compost pile. And you can see that the far left hasn't decomposed as much as the other 2. What was quite interesting was the level of the different levels of microbes we had within each of those piles, and that was really from the material that we used to make the compost. So we could really start mixing up those composts. If I've got a compost pile that's really high in protozoa, and then another pile that's low in protozoa but very high in fungi, then why not mix them? If we're making an extract, we can kind of make a blend, which works very well. Okay, next slide. So large scale windrow production, we wanted to move the dial at Ken Hill. And yes, we could do it through small batches of compost, but it would take a long time. And I don't have a long time. So we used quite a lot of the stewardship agreements that we have at Ken Hill and SFIs to grow our feedstock, which was quite handy. So it was just a matter of what I should have said on the outset. We've not used any fertilizers or chemicals now for 3 and a bit years. We've only just gone through the conversion of being organic. We're going through that currently now in a new stewardship scheme. So this grass or herbage ley that we've produced, we are using to make our compost. And we've chosen the varieties which and the density of different species within that herbal ley to get hopefully our right balance of high nitrogen material and our green material, which are two completely different things. So we've kind of got the balance we think about right. I think that changes throughout the years that's in a ley, but so we just forage. So we cut and we pick up straight away. We don't let wilts. We just pick it up while there's still lots of moisture within the grass. Okay, next slide, please. And then once we windrowed, we can make different. So that was in the spring. You saw the first photograph. This is the autumn. So we'd taken a cut of rye. So we had a rye crop off this field. You can see the straw, and then underneath we'd applied some clover in the early spring, and that has now grown really well through as soon as we harvested it. It's got late autumn, so all that solar radiation that would have been wasted through a conventional combining system when there's just stubble, we gathered all that solar radiation up. We applied a couple of applications of compost extract to that clover once we'd finished harvest, and we had quite a bulky clover material. It's really important when you're making your compost to understand how the high nitrogen works through your materials. So 10 to 1, 15 to 1 is a really great high nitrogen material, is clovers and legumes. When it starts getting a bit woody and we get between 15 and 20 to 1, then that material you have goes into the classification of green. So it no longer becomes, in the soil food web, it no longer becomes a high nitrogen. It will help, of course it will, but we need to know the levels of high nitrogen to make really good compost. And that high nitrogen makes the bacteria multiply, which heats up the pile. Without that, the pile won't go through the three turning processes to make sure the whole pile has been heated up. Okay, next slide, sorry. And then it is as basic, I'm afraid, as laying down our recipe. And this was in the spring. So we had laid down our wood chips, which are hard chips and probably 6 to 8 months old, not fresh. We try and get them as wet as we possibly can, and then apply our grasses, and then mix them up. Okay, next slide. And there's just a couple of slides there where you can the top left, we've got the chips on the top of this pile actually. We're just trying different ways of doing it, what works best. And we are now mixing for the first time. It's really important to get that moisture level correct when you're making your compost. You can see bottom left, the piles are starting to warm up very quickly. And then if we go to the right, I mean, that is sort of 6 months old compost with some nice levels of fungal hyphae within it. Okay, next slide, please. Throughout this whole process, it's really important to follow, and I'm afraid this is in Fahrenheit, it's really important to follow a procedure of when to turn. So top left, when you probe your compost, the clock starts ticking when you get to 131 degrees or 55 centigrade, and you have 72 hours. Now, hopefully that pile, as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, as you can see in my example, we go from 143 to 157 to 170 very quickly. Once that happens, then you need to turn, and the turning time relates to the temperature. That's very important. And once you've turned once, we're hoping to get a second turn within 24 hours. That is kind of ideal for us. And then you see the high nitrogen in this particular pile. It it started to drop. We turned on the 1st to the 12th. We turned because it got through that to that time, but it started to, the level of nitrogen was only just enough. That high nitrogen was only just enough to see it through. And then the moisture content, as I said, is really, really critical. 50% is ideal. And for those of you who don't know, really, if you get a handful of compost and squeeze it in your hand, if you get one drop out, you're about 50%. Okay, next slide, please. Really important once the compost is made to now manage or look at the amount of microbe you may or may not have within your compost. As a lab technician, I've carried out many samples of compost, and everyone tells me how brilliant their compost is, and great if it is, it's wonderful. But I tend just to look at the microbes that are within that compost. So you can't manage unless you measure, and I measure the amount of level of microbe to get to a biocomplete level. I mean, if you looked at David's compost results, we were at 0.06 as a fungal to bacterial ratio. That ideally needed to be at 0.3. So you can tell from that number, he was just shy of where he needed to be at the lower end of the scale with his fungal hyphae. So great levels of protozoa, and they will start reducing that bacterial level because of the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the bacteria and the protozoa. So measuring is really, really important, and I urge anyone who's making great compost, I'm sure, to really make sure it's good stuff, to whip it over a microscope in a proper way, not just glancing and finding things. You need to do it in a measured way. Okay, next slide. And hopefully there's something here, if we can click the video on this. So guys, you can see this is a field of view. So this is one field of view, and you can see, I'm not able to annotate, I'm afraid, but you can see the line going through the slide. That is a lovely bit of fungal hyphae. And just above it, there's like an oval shape. That is a nice protozoa. It's a testate amoebae, and that guy will be chowing down on all that bacteria. And we saw where you see those 4 little dots, there was a lovely flagellate, which is from the protozoa family, that was bubbling away. So you've got a great view there of stuff that's going on, and that is one field of view. I always do 25 fields of view, and there's, in one drop of solution, there's over 2,000 fields of view, and this is just one. So there is a lot in a drop of a soil solution or compost solution. Okay, next slide, please. We're also making compost from our waste materials. So we've got a bit of black grass and a bit of brome coming through our system. So this isn't for long term, because it'll just start flowering lower and lower. But to take the seed heads off, this is sterile brome, and we are now going through the composting process. And the result of the compost is there. We didn't quite get to a biocomplete level, but we weren't far from it at 0.17. But we had goodish levels of fungi. We didn't leave it that long, so if we left it longer, then we might the amount of fungal hyphae would have increased. Protozoa numbers would have reduced. We had good levels of protozoa, and we had some great levels of bacterial-feeding nematodes, over 2,000. So that was really, really great. So we take out a compost if I really want to go for protozoa and bacteria, because I've got really high levels of, if I want to reduce my bacterial numbers, good levels of protozoa, good levels of bacteria-feeding nematodes, I would take that compost now and make an extract with it. The fungal hyphae, yeah, there is some there. Am I at the level? No, I'm not. But actually, I want to reduce those levels of bacteria because they will chow down on the bacteria, the nematode. Sorry, the protozoa will chow down on the bacteria and release ammonium back into the soil within the rhizosphere. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just an example of what we've done at Ken Hill. And this is literally next door to David. So our soils are very similar to David, thin soils over chalk. And this is an application on the left of, I think that was 3.5, 4 tons of compost per hectare. So not a lot. And you can see there's a lot of gaps in there. So I'm tending to do one application of that, and then plenty, maybe 5 or 6 applications of extract. And the picture on the right is a field next door. And this was last spring. This would have been an April, May time. And I was staggered. And the first time in my whole career of agriculture, I have seen, when I've dug a field, I've seen visible fungal hyphae and great structure in sands and silts within my soils. So this has taken me sort of 2 and a bit years to get to this point. And as Liz has pointed out, the water holding capacity has also improved in our soils. Next slide. Was that the last one? Thank you. So how are we going to apply this stuff at scale? So I've tried many things to get us to that point. And these are some of the things we use with David on his field. So the top right is a GOT maker, and that is we take compost, we put it in a tea bag, and we bubble it with air, so all the microbes get bounced out into the water, and then we apply that water solution as an extract onto the soil. Or you could put it into seed. So we also drench our seeds at drilling. We don't do it and then put it in a bag. At drilling, we drench our seeds with about 150 litres a hectare of this very strong extract solution. But that's, small scale. We've got 450 hectares we need to get over really quickly, and we've just developed a new system with a tow and fert, which you guys are the first people to have seen this. So we've developed a basket which looks more like the picture on the left, where we are taking compost, we are putting into a large scale container, and we are using water and air to knock all those microbes about and put them into the water solution, and then applying it on a large scale. Now, what I would urge anyone who's looking at this is really important that you don't go above 2 bar pressure, and you try not to use sprayers that have had lots of chemicals in them, and maybe 90-degree angles and lots of valves and filters. That tow and fert doesn't have a filter in it, and is large scale. So we're putting on there 400 litres a hectare, so 10 hectares a load. And I can normally do about 120 hectares in a day. Okay, next slide. And this is just an example of what we've kind of done at Ken Hill. So you've got the chart on the right is probably the most important one. So we took a test of our soils 5th of April 2023, and that's typically where I see levels of bacteria, levels of fungi, and protozoa, and our fungal to bacteria ratio, so really poor throughout all the ploughing, applying synthetic inputs, and that's what it's done to our soils. And then over 6 applications, of a compost extract, then we've seen the levels of bacteria drop because the protozoa numbers have increased. And then we've seen the fungal hyphae go from 65 to over 1,700, which is getting close to our 1-to-1. We just need those protozoa to chow down a bit more on the bacteria. So our fungal to bacteria ratios on one of our fields is at now 0.6, and we've seen that improve over time. Next slide, please. That's it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nick. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we could have listened to you for even longer. And all our speakers tonight have just been fantastic. Thank you very much. We're going to open up the Q&A session now. We haven't anything submitted into the chat box yet. I'm just going to stop sharing and let our speakers come back onto the screen. Excellent. Thank you. Has anyone any questions they'd like to put forward? We'll leave it open for a few moments. I suppose right now I'm wondering, David, we've gone through some of those presentations. They sound technical. How does this relate back onto the farm in the sense of how did you find establishment this year? How did you find the applications? Can you talk us through some of that to make it more, I suppose, tangible in the sense of what's actually happening on your day-to-day management of it?
Yeah, I guess the detail is technical. That's why there's lots of people helping, and you can't be an expert in everything, can you? So, and I don't aspire to be really. Just got to keep looking after sheep and cows in the right way, try and get the system right. So yeah, just trying to pull in help really. Which we've got. So yeah, system this year, yeah, wheels have sort of fallen off this autumn really from a combination of a slightly dry autumn and blue tongue. So we work quite hard at budgeting stock versus forage supply, and the week that we got locked down with blue tongue, we were supposed to have 120 cattle leave and probably 500 sheep. So that has quickly skewed our feed budget. And they're right at the period in which we wanted to be resting things to build stalls for spring emergence of a lot of those legumes and things. So yeah, and our staff left. So all added the nice timing. So yeah, moved 500 cattle off farm onto various places. We're trying to move sheep off as best we can. Yeah, but it's tricky. So we have to manage our system in a way going forward that is going to be more resilient to stuff like this, whether it's an autumn drought or a blue tongue or a whatever. That might be suckler cows. I'd loath to say it might be growing fodder beet and grazing it. So we have a structure to our autumn where we might get cattle later. So the current structure is we get cattle in early spring and then they leave in the autumn. So it might be that we get them slightly later spring and we overwinter them on fodder beet, and then they're leaving a bit bigger in May and June. But that gives us the structure where those cattle are off, say 1st of September onto a fodder beet system, because what has happened this year can't really happen again.
And that's what I was going to touch on. This isn't the only trial happening on farm or the only thing going on farm. You have so many other enterprises and also other, I won't say experiments, but there's a lot going on that you're trying to manage at the moment. And I suppose just for the people who have joined us tonight, how much of the farm now would you say has gone in under the herbal ley or under one of these
essentially
schemes?
So we've entered into an SFI scheme, so we jumped out of 3 countryside stewardship schemes and have gone into a single SFI where home farm is 330 hectares, and I think we will have 10 that will not be multi-species lays, unless we're going to pull some of that out, put into fodder beet, which I don't really want to do because of it just doesn't fit with what we're trying to achieve. So you've got a really fairly high nitrogen demand, soil disturbance, bare earth in the winter, but we need 30 hectares to hold, say, 400 cattle through the winter. It might be a sacrifice that we have to make, but we'll see.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. We haven't had any.
But no, it's just for me. I just think it's. Sorry to interrupt, Katie. I just think it's an interesting one to debate, isn't it? Which is this, the puritanical views that some of us may have put up tonight versus how does it fit into a whole system. And I think that's, I suppose Dave is keen enough to try it on one field, isn't he, to try and understand whether this is working. But also within that is the challenges that this summer has had for some of those, the taller covers and the legume levels and all of that. So there is never going to be perfection, is there? That's the reality. What we're just trying to do is understand whether any of these like additional tools that we're now more aware of could be useful for Dave. But also equally, so could fodder beet. And so it's not this puritanical view is that thou shall we all do, we always have to do this. It is how it all fits together into a whole system.
Yeah, and if not having that contingency plan where we've created a structure where the animals are off, so we know that we're going to have enough autumn growth to keep those legumes and the diversity of the lays going, we could end up with a situation more frequently like this autumn where we're massively overgrazing, probably causing a bit of compaction, losing species. So we're having an impact on the whole farm system and impacting the following spring, and potentially the compounding growth improvement that we may or may not get with the system. We've got 12 hectares of fodder beet in this winter to do a trial on to see what sort of damage or not it might do. So yeah, we'll see. The alternative is we go down a suckler cow route, potentially go organic and do like a sort of like a bale grazing, deferred grazing winter, but it's making the financials of that system, which is probably the holy grail of where we see improving the farm from a soil perspective, from rambling a bit, from looking at it from a system. You know, we can lengthen our rotation time, we can have taller covers, we can be more resilient to drought, maybe offset some of that income with an organic payment, because we're essentially organic now. You know, we're not using any artificial inputs. But yeah, so we'll see. It's to be worked out.
And also it's how we capture the financial impacts. Do you mean the short? What we're recognizing in quite a lot of systems is we've made short-term changes for profitability or performance-driven reasons, which have had long-term impacts on soil. So what we need to do is to avoid that now happening within your system, don't we? So you're making decisions based on financials, which is completely appropriate. But how can we stop ourselves getting into the same trap that other?
Yeah, I mean, I hope we're a long way away from where we were. You know, potatoes, this is the last year. Sugar beet, this is the last year. Everything's going into multi-species lays, so hopefully those days are behind us for a while. But yeah.
We have a question sent in, and sorry to cut across you, David. For Nick, we have a question here that is, with the compost tea bag system, are you just using compost and water or adding additions like molasses as well? Also, what volume of compost roughly per 100 litres of finished product?
Gosh, okay. Well, we've only got 10 minutes left, so I will really go quickly on that. So if you're using water that's got for tap water, so chlorine in it, then you need to use some humic acid to neutralize the chlorine in the water. Very important. You don't want to go to all the effort of making an amazing compost and then tip it into something that's then the chlorine's going to kill the microbes. So do I add anything in? Yes, sometimes. So if I'm using tap water, I used to use a lot of tap water. I use humic acid. I also look at the hardness of the water. So I might use some citric acid to reduce the hardness of the water, to soften it up. You can get some quick strips to see how hard your water is. Microbes prefer softer water. That's quite cheap. I only use molasses when I'm feeding bacteria. And I use that when if I move soil very lightly, I use it as a rip and drip. So as I move the soil, I'll apply through a boom sprayer at the back some fish hydrolysate and some molasses. Application rates, well, that GOT machine you saw there, those baskets or bags hold about 20 kilos of compost. All depends on the weight, the moisture of the compost, but about 20 kilos. So for 100 litres, you need 2 kilos. And then, as I said about measuring, if you've got a great community of microbes in there, then you don't need to apply as much as you would do if you hardly had anything in there. So it's about what you've got in your compost. So that's a real difficult question. But if I apply compost, I would apply it at anywhere between 2 and 5 tons a hectare as a solid. If I use an extract, I'm normally applying that at about 20 kilos a hectare, but as an extract. So I'm after the microbes. And the wood chips at the end of it, once I have washed wood chips at the end, I put those straight back into the pile again.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. I'm going to take the last few minutes of the webinar, if that's okay. I just wanted to go through. I wanted to firstly thank you all of the speakers, for the informative presentations and for sharing your expertise with us today. I hope everyone found the session valuable and left with some new insights into how herbal Leys and soil health practices can really make a difference on your farm. Before we wrap up, I wanted to leave just on a final few notes. We'll be sending the recording of today's webinar and some additional resources around in the next 24 hours. So please do keep an eye out in your emails. What I have done is I put a slide up here. We have loads of information online on the work that David has done on his Monitor Farm journey so far. You can visit our knowledge exchange library. It's under Glover's Farm, and you will find reports and the different work that's been done there. I know Francis already touched on some of the work David did last year and the year before with Germinal and ADAS, looking at comparing 3 different GS4 mixtures, and it was some really interesting findings and a really interesting report to go through. We also have a series of videos that David has done about his soil health journey, the economics behind it, how he manages it, his grazing system. So again, there I'll signpost you to this, and those links will be included in the emails. If you're interested to learn more and get an opportunity to bring a compost sample or use a microscope, we will invite you to come along to our in-person event on the 3rd of December near King's Lynn. We're going to use this opportunity to get together and really dive in deeper to some of these topics, including, as I mentioned, that hands-on workshop aspect to it with the microscopes to visually assess compost and soil samples. And there'll be more information on this in the future, and it's already on our webpage of AHDB events webpage, and you can register for the event already. But the link will be included in your follow-up email, so keep an eye out. I want to thank our speakers again, and a big thank you as well to all of you who joined us today. I hope you have a great week, and we really look forward to seeing you in the future. So thank you.